Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great honour to be speaking and included in such a great programme. And my my paper today is sort of connected to a couple of issues that I'm looking at in my PhD. So I do welcome any feedback that you have on it, questions, and also suggestions for further things I can look at, as always. Writing to his father from Fort Augustus on the 26th of May 1746, Joseph York, aide-de-camp to the Duke of Cumberland, exclaimed, quote, "We are in the heart of the vile race now, and I wish were to extirpate," end quote. Now, York's desire to annihilate the entire Highland race was an extreme view, but his hard attitude towards that population group was typical of the British Army during a period of internal warfare. Such attitudes were shaped by the experiences of the army during the Rising, and they influenced how the British approached the problem of pacifying the region in the aftermath. Less than a decade after Culloden, unprecedented numbers of British soldiers were sent to North America as part of the British effort in the French and Indian War, where they faced similar problems attempting to pacify hostile and potentially hostile population groups in another fringe of the empire. This paper will briefly look at warfare in Scotland and North America and how it influenced the attitudes of the British Army towards various population groups. It will then consider the militarisation of the two countries more generally throughout the period 1745 to 1775 and the role that that process played in altering those British imperial attitudes. And though the 45 was not a uniquely Highland event, it was the Highlanders in particular that the British state blamed for the Rising, and most repercussions were primarily felt in the Highlands, with the exception of steps taken against Episcopalianism in the northeast. And the way that Highlanders as a population group were defined by the British during the 45 played a vital role in how the British Army responded to the Rising. The idea that the Highlands were a wild, barbarous country and that the Highlanders were a savage race was well established by the 18th century in the minds of philosophers, writers, and the general public, as well as the army and government. During the 45, the British Army and state repeatedly labelled the Highlanders as savages who were inherently rebellious. And Geoffrey Plank has highlighted that by defining the Highlanders as savages, the British suggested that they were all equally guilty for the actions of the Jacobites, and that they were backwards and therefore collectively required corrective policies. And this led to a blurring of the military-civil divide and confusion amongst British Army officers regarding how to treat both the Jacobites and the non-combatants, resulting in the violence adopted by the army in the Highlands. And of course, there are numerous examples of prisoners being killed, houses burnt, livestock and provisions destroyed, and whole parts of the country laid to waste, during and after the Rising. And brutality was often viewed as a justified necessity in the 18th century, when a civilised nation was attempting to bring a savage nation to peace. In addition, the Jacobite Rising was interpreted as an alien invasion into England that represented a real threat to British liberties and to the British Empire. This led to a clear determination on the part of the British Army to punish the whole savage race that to them represented the Jacobite threat. And whilst the view that Highlanders were savages was common throughout Britain in the 18th century, the internal warfare triggered by the Jacobite uprising amplified such views and led to suggestions such as that of extirpation by Joseph York and also to Cumberland's plan to transport whole clans to the colonies. And although neither of these suggestions were implemented, the existence of such strong views regarding the savageness and otherness of the Highlanders within the minds of those commanding the army ensured that the initial interactions of the army during pacification were driven by violence, a desire to punish all Highlanders for the 45, and a determination to gain a total submission from the Highlanders and complete loyalty to the Crown moving forward. And in North America, similar ideas concerning civility and barbarity affected how the British responded to warfare, both internal and external. The language and actions adopted by army officers highlight the influence of the 45 on the army in North America. James Wolfe used very similar language when describing Scottish Highlanders and French Canadians, making his contempt towards both groups clear. Having described the villainous nature of the Highlanders in 1751 and expressed his pleasure that the British had left few alive at Culloden, he went on to state in 1758 that it would give him, quote, pleasure to see the Canadian vermin sacked and pillaged, end quote. And throughout the 1759 campaign against Quebec, Wolfe described the French Canadians as being one and the same as their Native American allies, implying that both groups were savages. He gave orders to reintroduce monetary rewards for scalps, not only for Native Americans as had been common in the past, but also for Canadians who were dressed as such. And because the Canadians generally acted in conjunction with the Native American forces, this order effectively gave his soldiers impunity to scalp any Canadian they encountered. And definitions applied to the Highlanders during the 45 were applied to both French Canadians and Native Americans during the French and Indian War, as officers identified what they believed to be similarities in all three groups. And as had been the case in Scotland, these definitions led to a blurring of the military-civil divide and led the British to ignore the rules of warfare during the conflict. Punitive measures were adopted against both groups, and all men, women and children were considered equally guilty for aiding the French in the war against Britain. Again, houses and crops were burnt, men and civilians killed, provisions seized and livestock driven off. And particularly violent tactics were suggested and adopted in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, when the British were attempting to pacify Native American nations during Pontiac's War. And it was again the perceived savagery of the population group in the eyes of the British Army that directly contributed to the adoption of such violent tactics against both population groups. But during times of peace, violence played a much reduced role in the interactions of the British Army. In the post-conflict period, the army was usually reduced in number and moved into peacetime garrisons. But in both the Highlands and North America, significant armed forces remained over a longer term, and a general militarization of the region occurred. The Highlands had been militarized to some extent in the immediate aftermath of Culloden, and this process deepened in the region over the following decades. A standing army remained active in the Highlands, forts and garrisons were constructed, improved or enlarged, and extensive road and bridge building campaigns were undertaken in order to allow a strong military presence to be felt throughout the region. The Enlightenment and emerging ideas concerning stadial theory contributed to the development of measures designed to civilize and improve the Highlands, such as the annexation of 13 Jacobite estates to the Crown in 1752. The annexed estates were to be run by a commission which was to encourage agricultural improvements, develop manufacturing, and commercially link the Highlands with the Lowlands and with England. And loyalty and submission to the Crown remained the primary goal, even in these steps, which were designed to civilise the barbarous Highlanders. And the militarisation of the region continued, with the settlement of discharged soldiers and sailors upon the annexed estates. Active soldiers took a policing role in the Highlands, ensuring that the legislation enacted in the aftermath of the Rising was adhered to, and that civilians were not carrying arms or wearing Highland dress. And the escalation of the French and Indian War into a European conflict in the mid-1750s continued the militarisation process as large-scale Highland recruitment into the British Army began in earnest. The militarisation of the Highlands ensured that an implied military threat remained in the region to discourage future risings or disorders. It also emphasises the otherness of both the region and the population group in the eyes of the British Army and State. It was believed necessary not only to civilise the people, but also to tame and civilise the landscape in order to open up access to the region and to assimilate Highlanders more closely within Britain and the Empire. The measures adopted by the British imperial elite in the post-Culloden period did not represent a sudden shift in British policy, as the British had been attempting to secure peace in that region for centuries, and Highland society had been evolving over the previous decades due to steps taken by the Highlanders themselves to become more commercial. However, although it did not represent a material change in British policy in the Highlands, the militarisation of the region was a clear step away from violence and punishment and towards securing loyalty, civility, and long-term security, representing a clear evolution in the pacification of the Highlands. And this was mirrored by a more general evolution in the British Army at this juncture, as its purpose became less fixed simply as a fighting force, and it increasingly played an important role in civilising savage nations and governing groups of others in the places it was active. The militarisation of the Highlands was a way for the British imperial elite not only to secure peace in the region on a long-term basis, but also to govern a potentially hostile population in a geographical fringe of the empire, and to try and overcome the otherness of the Highlanders by assimilating them more closely within the empire. The process led to interactions that were not primarily driven by violence on the part of the British Army, but rather were driven by commercial and by other interests. British measures catalysed changes in Highland society that were already emerging, and increased accessibility to the Highlands reduced the alienness of both the region and its people. And this, coupled with the lack of a continued military threat from the region and the integration of Highlanders into the army, had helped to soften British attitudes and question the supposed savagery of the Highlanders by the late 1760s and early 1770s. And attitudes did not change immediately, and even into the 19th century, it was not uncommon for Highlanders to be described as savages. Nonetheless, though the Highlanders remained an other in the eyes of the British imperial elite, the militarisation process had helped to reduce their perceived alienness and barbarity, and they were increasingly thought of as subjects of the crown, rather than simply as savages. During and after the French and Indian War, the British also embarked on a process of militarisation in the North American colonies, where the evolution of the army into a force not simply for fighting, but for civilising and for governing was clear, and where direct and indirect experiences of pacification and militarisation in the Highlands affected attitudes and policies moving forward over the next 2 decades. During the course of the war, unprecedented numbers of British soldiers were sent out to fight in the colonies. After the Treaty of Paris in 1763, a standing army of 10,000 men remained in the colonies to protect the territory ceded to Britain and to respond to the internal warfare with several Native American nations that broke out that same year. The task for the army in North America was on a much vaster scale than it had been in Scotland, as the country was larger and much more extreme. And not only that, the absorption of Canada into the British Empire meant that the British had 2 potentially hostile population groups that they had previously classified as savages to both pacify and govern in that geographical fringe of the empire. As in Scotland, forts and garrisons were constructed and improved, particularly in areas where the security of the empire was thought to be most vulnerable, including Canada, the Floridas, and throughout the backcountry. Civilising measures similar to those adopted by both the state and Protestant missionary groups in the Highlands were encouraged by the army, which aimed to encourage the spread of Protestantism and the English language amongst Native American nations. Military management of commerce was proposed in the Plan for the Future Management of Indian Affairs. Though not drafted until 1764, that plan had been under the consideration of the Board of Trade since 1754, just 2 years after the annexation of the Jacobite estates to the Crown. The plan aimed to create a trade that was open to all colonists, but that was centrally regulated by the Crown and managed by the British Army at various forts and garrisons. And although the plan was not implemented in its entirety, various aspects of it were, and the military was responsible for managing trade between colonists and Native Americans at garrisons throughout the backcountry for a number of years. The British hoped that introducing state control over commerce would help to ensure long-term peace and security in the backcountry, as they believed the Commission for the Annexed Estates had successfully achieved in the Highlands. Again, militarisation was not only a way for the British to try and secure long-term peace in a region that warfare had rendered unstable, it also allowed the British a way to try and govern potentially hostile populations that were far from the central control of London, and to attempt to assimilate groups of others more closely within the empire. As had been the case in the Highlands, militarisation was well established in North America by the mid-1760s, and it led to an increase in commercial and civil interactions of the British Army, as opposed to interactions driven by violence as a result of active warfare. And over the same period, the attitudes towards Scottish Highlanders were gradually beginning to evolve. British attitudes towards other population groups in North America were also changing. And though this was happening in response to similar processes in both countries, changes were not uniform towards the various population groups that the British Army encountered. Attitudes towards French Canadians began to change almost immediately after the conquest, as Canada was left under British control, and the classification of the Canadians as savages, which had been so common during the period of active warfare, was almost instantly discontinued. And this is clear in the example of James Murray, who had led scouting parties up the St. Lawrence River during the Quebec campaign, devastating the settlements of savage Canadians. As governor of Quebec, Murray's language quickly softened, and although differences in law, language and religion meant that the army still viewed the Canadians as an other within the empire, that population group was quickly accepted as subjects of that empire. Attitudes towards Native Americans changed much less noticeably and remained influenced by ideas concerning civility. The labelling of Native Americans as savages did decrease in the years following Pontiac's War, though it did not disappear entirely. The British Army did, however, increasingly come to view the Native Americans as another group of subjects to be governed, rather than simply as savages, as the efforts of Thomas Gage and other British military officers to ensure a fair policy in the backcountry between Native Americans and colonial backcountry settlers provides evidence for. As militarisation in Scotland and North America affected British attitudes towards Highlanders, Native Americans and French Canadians, British attitudes towards North American colonists also began to change. Colonists had always been thought of as British citizens, whether they had been born in Britain or in the colonies. But the process of militarisation had caused changes in British attitudes by the late 1760s. And in an empire consisting of numerous population groups, the colonial North American settlers increasingly came to be viewed not as British citizens, but as subjects of the Crown, and simply as one more group of others to be governed by the British imperial elite. And this is best evidenced by Thomas Gage, who in 1769 exclaimed that he hoped the British would soon see that these people are no longer British. This paper has argued that specific instances of warfare in Scotland and North America between 1745 and 1775, as well as the militarisation of the two countries more generally, played a vital role in shaping the attitudes of the British Army towards various population groups within the British Empire. The legacy of the 45 extended far from the British Isles. influencing attitudes, actions, and policy in North America up until the outbreak of the Revolution. And for this reason, I would argue that whilst the conference has suggested the 45 as a useful end date for the early modern period, when considering Scottish history within the wider context of British imperial history, perhaps an end date of 1775 or even 1783 would be more appropriate. Thank you.